The show on the road. Listen, we are now ready for our keynote presentation. And like I said yesterday, it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to work with such talented young producers that are willing to share information with all of us. It's really just when I first started learning about soil health, similar to what Brittany talked about, I heard about renegade farmers and I heard about farmers that were doing things differently. And just being a naturally curious person, my brain ticked towards them and said, I got to figure out what they're doing. And it was guys like Russell Hedrick, Michael Thompson, Gail Fuller, Todd Tobin that took the time to take a woman who did not grow up in a farming family and took that time to explain it to me. So this is the culmination of many, many years working together. But it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Russell Hedrick, who is the co-founder of Regen Mills Heritage Grain and works alongside Dr. Liz Haney with Soil Regen. So, ladies.
How about we give Lance Gunderson at Regen Ag Labs a round of applause for putting that lunch together for us. So, I kind of tailored my PowerPoint today. I had a lot of producer questions yesterday. How do we do this? How do we apply this? How do we work within this system? Ask questions during this PowerPoint. That's one of the keys I wanted to bring is if you have a question about your farm, if you have a question about what we're talking about, raise your hand. We'll see. Gail, do you mind running around the microphone if we do have questions? So, you know, one of the key topics we keep talking about is what is regenerative agriculture. And about 2-3 years ago, Jess Canad made a post on Facebook and she was like, hey, what's your definition of regen ag? And this is my definition of regenerative agriculture. There was probably 70, 80 different farmers that posted on there what's their definition of regenerative ag, what it meant to them. And it was really from one end of the spectrum to the other end. The thing that we are working on at Soil Regen is we actually have a test for that now. We're not looking at comparing my farms in North Carolina to a farm in Kansas, but Liz and Rick Haney have actually came up with a test now that we can actually look at your soils. Huh? Riz, yeah. We call her Riz from now on. But we actually have a way to test to see if your ground is actually regenerative. I will give you the bad news. I had one of my farms fail the other week. So we've got a farm that we got that was really degraded. I was like, hey, this thing is doing awesome. Let's do this test on it. And then Rick called me and he was like, hey, good news, you failed. Didn't meet the standard, so we still have work to do on that one. So let me give you an idea of what North Carolina looks like this time of year. So in North Carolina, we have restless tillage syndrome just like everywhere else. Manage your residue. As a young beginning farmer, I was told, hey, you know, if you plant BT corn, then you have to deal with all that stover and all that residue, and it doesn't break down because it's BT corn. It really had nothing to do with BT corn. It had to do with the fact that our ground is essentially dead. A lot of the ground that we picked up was farms that other farmers had let go of the leases, years of tobacco use. They would go out in the fall, and for whatever reason, they didn't like what corn stover looked like. I can't see it from my house except for the field we live on, so it doesn't bother me. They'll do this. The big thing that, you know, I've learned about all tillage is it destroys in one fashion or another. Yes, we have to do it. We have to fix ruts on our farms. We have to do management decisions to where we have to level up land after years if we've had water issues, but every time we pull a piece of steel across the ground, it's destroying something in one way or another. So this is what it looks like all winter. They'll come out here, they'll disc it, they'll bed it, they leave it like this, all the water's on top, all the nutrients are leaving the field. One of the things that I do enjoy about this is we get free topsoil. We typically farm on sloped ground, so every winter my neighbors above the hill that disc, we send them a nice gift basket at Christmas time, say thanks for the free topsoil and fertility, helps me reduce my inputs. And then this is what they do in season. Jimmy talked about that aggregation. He talked about when you're disking, you're breaking those particle sizes down. NC State University actually did some tests with vertical tillage tools. And they did a great job of loosening up that top inch or two, but all those silt particles and those fine clay particles, we're actually calling it vertical compaction now, because they're actually breaking up and they're going down and filling up all the pore spaces, and they essentially turn that ground into a concrete parking lot, and then you can't get your planter into it if it hasn't rained in a few days. And so when the water can't get in there and it starts drowning out the crop, now we come in the middle of the season with a ditcher, and we cut a beautiful ditch through the field. So now all the topsoil ends up in the ditch here. This is one of our neighbors. And then the state has to clean the ditches out. And so after a few times, they actually started fining this farmer for their labor that they were having to clean these ditches out. And I mean, the most productive part of our ground is in the top 6 inches. How many top 6 inches, you know, how many tons of that key topsoil is in that ditch now? So I was very fortunate. When I went into farming, we were so broke that we couldn't afford tillage equipment. We couldn't afford some of the things that we were told we needed, and you know, no-till was a start for us, and that was one of the benefits. And so we plant cover crops on 100% of our acres. A producer was asking me this morning, how do you know what your cover crop blend needs to be? So if you've never done a mixed species cover crop before, when we work with new producers, beginners, we are talking about a 3-species blend. We want a small grain, we want a legume, and we want a broadleaf. We can manage that as farmers with existing equipment. There's not a lot of infrastructure change. Chemical programs that we're using typically already will still be able to terminate these cover crops. Once we get a couple years into that practice, we look at adding more to it. We look at adding rye, triticale, more legumes, more broadleafs. Don't go out there. I can't tell you how many conferences I've went to and we talk about cover crops or beginning a new practice, and a farmer's like, great, we're going to go put 20 species out there. And then, you know, the next spring they call me back and they say, hey, I tried cover crops, they suck, I'm not doing them again. It all goes back to understanding what you're doing. And then you're going to have to change that cover crop as time progresses. So what we used to use as cover crops, we've actually had to increase the seeding rate, because as soil biology becomes more active, they're going to consume more of that organic material. And so now we have to continue to bump up our rates ever so often to make sure that we have enough residue. And the biggest thing I say is watch your carbon and nitrogen ratios. It's the same thing that Lance talked about earlier. And it's the same thing that I talked about on the panel yesterday. 60 pounds of rye is good, 140 pounds of rye is not so good. Because if you don't have the system to deal with that residue and to deal with that carbon source, you're essentially going to lock your nutrients up. And what we have found on our farm and what we shoot for is a 40-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when we're putting our mixes together and we're putting our blends together, at 40-to-1 on our soil types, and it may be different in Kansas, this will be something that you'll have to work with, but at 40-to-1, we see about 90% of that residue break down in the first year. And so that means that we're getting 90% of that nutrient release back to that first crop. And that's what we want. We want nutrient cycling. So how we do it, this is what one of our basic blends look like. This right here is actually called the home run mix. This is one that we're shooting for the fences. It grazes very well with our livestock. It also produces a lot of nitrogen. We use this typically before our corn crop. And then we've also got this mix. This is one of our summer mixes. 2015, we started doing summer cover crops for grazing, planted a bunch of sorghum Sudan grass, went with BMR varieties because they were better for grazing. Found out very quickly that BMR varieties do not handle heat and stress very well. And so in the middle of the drought, we had cover crops that may have been knee tall on me. When the cows ate it, you couldn't walk within 6 feet behind of them or you would be painted green. A lot of life lessons learned that year, so we try to mix. So we use a regular sorghum Sudan grass mixed with BMR, about 50-50. We also put pearl millet in there. We put sun hemp, we put cowpeas, buckwheat. We've got all different varieties, so it's essentially like a salad bar for cattle instead of just one straight species that may not handle stress very well. And so this is what our cover crops look like now. This is our home run mix again. We started even looking at different species. So if you're planting your corn early, woolly pod vetch nodulates faster than hairy vetch. It's simply changing out a vetch variety that we can see nodulation quicker and we can plant timely, versus if we plant hairy vetch, like in North Carolina, we probably wouldn't see maximum nodulation until about the end of April, the 1st of May. So that brings us to our next thing. Education is important, farming is more importanter. Only some of y'all fell asleep from lunch. That was my test. If y'all fall asleep, I'm gonna make you stand up for a minute. So we work a lot with universities. I work with University of Georgia. I work with NC State University, even as far as Florida State. And so the University of Georgia came up with a nitrogen calculator for cover crops, for the residue. I use the Haney test. They don't like it. I can't tell you why. Maybe they're just not smart enough to understand it. So they wanted to do these strip trials. So they put water probe sensors. We actually put scales in our field. They harvested the cover crop residue, put it in like a nylon mesh bag and set it on top of that sensor. In real time, every day, we could see how that cover crop residue broke down, the nutrient release back into the soil profile. They did their N calculator, which is the University of Georgia. The N farm was the Haney test, and then they actually came in January and sprayed our cover crop out in the no cover crop strips, and we replicated this across the field. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the data. Essentially what the data said is if you plant straight cereal rye, which was in one of our plots, this is the nitrogen availability calculator. If you plant a solid stand of cereal rye and you had 4,600 pounds of dried biomass, down here it says this cover crop is predicted to release 0 pounds of nitrogen on this farm over the next 3 months. We actually were only at like 2 pounds of nitrogen in the first 12 months. The carbon to nitrogen ratio was way too high. So this is what the total case study actually looked like. The key points of this case study was by using cover crops and no-till, we were actually able to increase the water infiltration rate in the first year by 70%. That's a massive amount of water that we were actually able to put into the soil profile in just a 12-month period. Then we started looking at how do cover crops break down? How do we get nitrogen? How do we get phosphorus out of these cover crop mixes? So if we terminated it too early, so typically where I'm at, a cover crop in North Carolina is you put wheat out in the fall, it gets about 4 inches tall, and they burn it down before you can actually get any biomass or benefit from root structure. So we terminated part of these cover crops in March on the 29th. There was a total of 28 pounds of nitrogen in that cover crop and 21 pounds of it released in the first 4 weeks. Well, I don't need it then. Corn isn't using a ton of nitrogen in the beginning of the season. I need it later in the season. So how do we change that? We waited until May the 9th to terminate the other part of the plot. We had built almost 2.5 times the amount of total nitrogen, and we actually only released 20 pounds of it in the first 4 weeks, and that additional nitrogen that we were able to build actually lasted about 4 to 5 more weeks into the season before it even started to release. So if you're using cover crops and you're using soil health practices and the principles and the things that we're using on our farm, yes, we are saving a ton of money. But at the same time, we are doing more management. So be prepared to walk your fields, do biomass checks, send a sample to the lab, have them run a nutrient analysis on it. But at the end of the day, if you're saving $100,000 and you're putting an extra 100 hours of work into your farm, is it worth 100 hours of work for you to make $100,000? Absolutely, any day of the week. So how did our journey really start? I met this guy. This is Lee Holcomb. He is a NRCS employee. At that time, he was a DC. Now he's actually an AC. He's over the half part or the middle third of our state. I learned so much information from Lee. Are there any NRCS employees in here? Is Candy even here? Okay. Well, since you're the only one, I can say this. Oh, are you an NRCS employee? Okay. Well, I hope I don't hurt your feelings then. I've been to 46 states in this country. Candy Thomas, Adam Daughtery, and Lee Holcomb are probably the 3 top NRCS employees that I can talk about. And I know that they care about producers. The other 97% I met, they suck. And I hope they do better. And I don't mean that because Lee came to my farm on Saturdays, on Sundays, after 5 o'clock, after hours, because farming doesn't run 8 to 5. And he has spent so much time with me going through this process. Right here, we were doing our corn checks for our different cover crop yield trials. We were looking at earthworm counts, soil aggregation. This guy put so much time and investment in our farm. I hope that you have NRCS agents like that here. And if you don't, complain to them. I hope they do better. I can't guarantee that they will. So the story behind Lee Holcomb is you saw the picture of our first year of cover crops. They were about knee high. The second year we did cover crops, Lee said, hey, you should let at least 1 or 2 fields get high biomass and see what you can do with them. This is field number 1 of high biomass cover crops. So that's a John Deere 4830. My cousin is actually running that sprayer. He went and sprayed that field with Gramoxone and Envive. He made one single pass through that field, got out, looked at me, and he said, you're crazy. I won't tell you what he actually said, but the gist of it was, you're crazy. He said, there's absolutely no way that you're going to plant a crop into this. If you need a big bush hog, this is our second year of farming. We had like a 5-foot bush hog. He's like, if you need a 15-footer, you can come borrow it so you can deal with this stuff. So after we sprayed it, Lee came out, Dana came out, and some other NRCS employees. And as you can see, this rye is literally taller than me. Has anybody in here ever had rye that tall as a cover crop? Well, I know Gail has. Anybody else? So the one thing I'll say is Zeb Winslow, a good friend of mine, said I was either really smart or really stupid, because when he found out we were farming 700 acres, and we were rolling all of our cover crops 7 feet at a time. If you've never had a nosebleed, you should let rye get about that tall and then roll it in an open station tractor. We used to roll about 700 acres, 7 foot at a time. It was a lot of days, a lot of nights, but it was what we tried to do. Luckily now we don't do that. We've learned. But this is what our ground cover looks like. This is what the cover crop looks like standing compared to the tractor. And when I used to drive that tractor, I had to stand up on it while driving it from end to end on some of these fields. And so we get this cover crop rolled. NRCS is still here at the farm. And we go out there and measure it. And we're between about 7 to 8 inches deep of residue. I have anxiety at this point because my cousin just said I was crazy. I've never seen anything this tall or this deep. What am I going to do? And I told Lee, I was like, man, what am I going to do? And Lee's like, oh, I got a meeting. I got to get out of here. You just let me know how this works. And I was like, no. I was like, you got me into this. You're going to be right here, or we're going to wrestle. So I'm out here planting the headlands around this field, and Lee's out here pulling residue apart, going into the seed furrow. We plant our beans typically about 1.5 inches. We like to put beans deep. We have really good soil aggregation because these cover crops, they come up really good. The deeper we go, the more moisture there is available at that time. And we didn't have a problem. Like, there was not an issue of planting through 7 to 8 inch deep residue, getting the crop in the ground, except for one major issue. We didn't have row cleaners, and the gauge wheels on our John Deere corn planter was actually on top of the cover crop residue, and it was kind of hard to get a good, even, consistent depth. So we don't run our row cleaners now where they're actually sweeping anything. We like the frame of the row cleaner because it pushes the cover crop residue around, and now our gauge wheels actually run on top of the soil. It makes it a lot easier. So this is a picture once these soybeans came up. NC State sent out some of their summer interns. Lee came out there. We started looking through this residue, and we were finding pigweeds that were 2 and 3 feet long that were growing in the direction that this cereal rye was laid down, and they were turning yellow and white. Essentially, they had enough to germinate, but when they germinated and went with the direction of the cereal rye, they didn't have enough energy to actually make it through that mat. And so that was one of the key indicators to me, is this really is good for weed control. So once again, I let Lee talk me into a lot of different things that I probably never would have done. And Lee said, don't spray any herbicide on it. Don't put anything post over the top. Don't worry about, adding any more chemicals to it. Just see what happens. And I was like, well, if this field completely fails, we're not going to lose the farm, so we'll try it. So this is a picture 7 weeks after planting time. You can see that we're starting to get row closure. You could pull the residue back. We still had really, really nice moisture in the ground. That rye really kept that ground cool and kept that moisture in place. And to have no herbicides, that field is absolutely clean. Like, it was amazing how clean that field stayed. And so we went back out later in the season. We would, check on our plants. We were doing population and stand counts. You could go out there and right now we're at about R1. You could pull the canopy back. We still had great ground cover. My neighbor's from Louisiana, and he has 2 teenage kids. And when they were in high school and they got in trouble, they had to come work on the farm as the convicts. And one of the things that I hated doing was pulling weeds. And so this is John. This is their oldest son. So this farm right here, this is about a 30-acre farm. We ended up pulling about 6 pigweeds out of that whole entire field with no post herbicides. Versus where we didn't have cover crops in our check strip, it was, we grew amazing crops of palmer where we didn't have this cover crop. And so this is the first year that we actually yielded pretty well. You can see in the picture, we'll have like a small patch of Johnson grass here. There's a small patch of Johnson grass here. We're not going out and spraying an entire 30-acre field for a small escape of, 3 foot by 3 foot. It's not worth it. It's not worth the money. We go out here, we'll pull a few weeds, but this is actually the first year that we broke 80 bushels. This field ended up yielding about 86.5 bushels, placed second in the state. So then we talked about fertilizer management. This is the farm that I live on. This is the first farm that we actually bought. So 2012, we bought this farm. We used synthetic fertilizer, full chemical program. Then we started going into our regenerative path. 2013, we raised 187 bushel corn. 2014, 62 bushel beans. You can see these are all the years, the crops, and all the yields that we've made off of this farm, and all we have applied is nitrogen and sulfur. We have not applied P or K onto this farm since 2012. Everybody says you can't do that. You're going to mine your soils, right? Can't do that. So this is the first test that I could find for today. So this test was actually taken in 2015. Our organic matter was 2.29%. Phosphorus was 98 pounds per acre. Potassium, 340. If you look, this was part of our test this year. We pulled our Haney test before I came out here so we could show you where we were at. It was taken about 7-8 days ago. Our 0 to 6, the organic matter has went from 2.29 to 4.2 from 2015 to 2021. That right there was amazing to me. Our phosphorus, total phosphorus per acre, is still at 105. Well, how can that happen? We're sending rye roots 4 and 5, 6 feet deep in the profile. We're breaking down nutrients. It comes back up into a plant available form. We terminate that cover crop, and now those nutrients are on top of the ground. So we're essentially creating a nutrient cycle that we're pulling nutrients from deep in the profile and we're bringing them back up. And I talked to y'all yesterday about how we pull our nutrient samples different. We don't pull 6-inch soil samples anymore. We pull them all the way down to 12 to 18 inches. So this is our 6 to 12-inch sample, and our organic matter is still at 2.6%. So I actually still have more organic matter in 6 to 12 than what I had in 0 to 6 5 years ago. So what about planting equipment? Everybody wants to know about planting equipment. So this is one of the planters that we built out of a Kinsey twin frame bar. We ran it for about 2 or 3 seasons. I was at a cover crop conference. A guy said, hey, can you build a cover crop roller pretty cheap for a planter? And I was like, yeah. I was like, I could probably build one for less than $100. He's like, I'll make you a $100 bet. And I was like, all right, deal. So I went to Tractor Supply and bought 2 6-inch fence posts and 4 pieces of chain. We hung these fence posts from the front of the corn planter. I think we ended up, putting down close to 500-600 acres of cover crops with just some fence posts before we actually had to replace the chains. We had a chain break. Then we moved forward to today. I was at a farm show. walked up to a Yetter booth. They had a display up there, and the guy's name was Gary Finning. And I said, hey, how much are those? And he was like, that's a display model. That's not for a corn header. I was like, I need 3 of those. And he was like, what kind of corn header do you have? I said, it's a John Deere 7000 corn planter. And he looked at me like I had 3 heads. Like, what are you going to do with this on a corn planter? We made absolutely no modifications to the roller system, to the corn planter. The only thing we did was we added a 1/4-inch piece of steel plate because this was a 2 1/4-inch bar and this was made for a 2 1/2-inch bar, so we had to make up that difference. And so we put the Yetter stalk devastators on there. They roll the cover crops. We used to run a Dawn curve tine row closer for closing wheels. I've liked them a lot. One of the worst things that we ever had happen is, not saying they're a bad tool, they just don't work in our system, but we bought these Martin spike closing wheels, and they looked really aggressive, and with tight clay, I was like, oh, they're just gonna close that up real good. They did close it up good for about the first 5 feet. The next 40 acres from end to end, it made beautiful round bells out of rye from one end to the other, and like, it was an absolute nightmare. And all we did is we knocked the rye off and left it there, and it was cattle feed by the end of the year. So then we changed to the Dawn curve tine, never had an issue with them. We finally wore those out. And as our ground has progressively gotten better and we need less nutrients and we have better nutrient cycling, and as we cut back, I hated broadcasting 50 pounds of DAP or 100 pounds of DAP. I was like, there's got to be a way for us to do this more economically. I was talking to Rick. Rick said if you can band your phosphorus and actually get it a little bit incorporated deeper into the profile, you can cut back greatly on it. So we started running this 2x2 system, and we changed out to these poly closing wheels as well. This is how we run all of our phosphorus now. We put out 11:37:0 at planting time if we need phosphorus. If not, we just run straight 32% out for corn and get our nitrogen out there. So this is what it looks like planting on our farm. The joke is that Adam Daugherty came up with is you can get about 3 Sasquatch families inside of this Sasquatch habitat. You know, Lance said he got his first cowboy hat. Where's Lance at? Did he leave it? So Lance got his first cowboy hat, and he was looking on the inside of it, and he said, well, what do these X's stand for? And I said, well, when there's not a lot of X's in your cowboy hat, that means it's made out of mostly some kind of weird hair. It ain't good rabbit hair on there. And then he said, well, what about Jimmy Eamon's cowboy hat? And I said, well, it's a 50X, and it's made out of Sasquatch hair. Now, people have to comb through the woods and the cover crops to find that Sasquatch hair, and that's why they're so expensive, is because it's so rare. But there's the ultimate, you know, undefeated hide-and-seek champion. It does, a little bit. It's a little resemblance. Jimmy Eamons, I'll tell y'all a funny story real quick. Jimmy sends me this Facebook post about a year ago in Oklahoma State. What is it, a $2-3 million reward if you can capture a real picture of a Sasquatch in its native habitat? And I said, dang, I said, I'll never be able to take a river bath again in Oklahoma. At least I'm keeping them awake today. So, you know, finally, after years and years of hard farm labor, riding in open station tractors, we got to move up to Club John Deere. That's been a blessing of a tractor. But, you know, just to go show you, this is what we're shooting for in the Southeast. I'm not saying that this is what you're going to shoot for in Kansas. In the South, we build biomass. In the North, y'all build organic matter, colder climates. Just, we cycle nutrients. Our ground never freezes. You know, to give you an idea, we have a construction company. We put in a lot of water pipe. We don't have to go but a foot deep. You know, we're not worried about water busting. Down here, Kansas, the funny thing is, I was talking to Michael Thompson one day, and I was planting cover crops in like the 1st of December, and he was like, yeah, we're just here at the house. I was like, man, you need to be out planting cover crops. And he was like, no, that don't happen here in December. He's like, we're typically pretty cold. That's not going to work. So it really did teach me a lot of context about the difference between where I'm at, where you're at, what we're trying to achieve. But this is what we do. We go for total ground coverage when we're spraying. You can see the difference between our headlands where we're going into our A-B lines. And then it brings me up to another point. I called up my seed dealer in 2014 and I said, hey, we want some non-GMO corn seed. And he was like, all right, cool. He's like, but you don't want it. And I said, why not? And I got an education on every worm known to man that would come and absolutely decimate all of those corn seeds. And then he was telling me about, chemical, what are you going to spray on it if you have an escape? So I called an older gentleman that lives in North Carolina. I think Jimmy's about 80 years old now. And I was like, hey, what did you use on corn before we had Roundup? And he said, you Roundup babies will never learn. That's what he calls my generation, is Roundup babies. And he starts naming off, Steadfast Q, Ascent Q, Realm Q, all these different herbicides that if we needed them, we could use them. And then I was talking to my dad about the worm issue, and I was like, well, what about all these worms and all these insects that are going to come decimate this corn because it's not traded? And he said, well, you ever seen worms in a U-Haul going down the road? If you haven't, just plant the daggum corn and see what happens. So we planted our first non-GMO crop. That year, we ended up breaking over 200 bushels with a non-GMO hybrid, and we haven't looked back since. Y'all saw what our corn looked like yesterday. Typically, we're blessed with some pretty good crops. I remember my first trip down to Texas. I went to the ARS research station with Rick. We left out of there, and the corn was like 6 foot tall and already tasseled. And I was like, hey, man, what kind of variety is that? Because if you had to spray over that late in the season, that'd be a good variety. And he said, no, that's regular corn. That's just Texas corn. He said it doesn't get but like 5 or 6 feet tall. So we started looking at different kinds of crops we can plant. Last year we started experimenting. Anybody in here ever done 60-inch corn? Anybody at all? We got at least a couple. So Lauren Steinloggy, a couple different guys that we talked to were telling us about this 60-inch corn. We decided to try it out last year. We did it a little bit different. We have such a long growing season that typically, like Lauren in Iowa, he's interplanting his cover crop mixes at V4, V5. I decided we were actually going to go in at tassel. We went in at tassel time, so this is right before we started to get the cover crop out. We have good rains in August, so broadcast would work fine for us. So we broadcasted into the 60-inch corn. And on your right-hand side is our 30-inch corn. On the left-hand side is our 60-inch corn. The total difference ended up being about 4 bushels per acre. That's what we gave up. But there was an article that just came out in Progressive Farmer specifically about this field. We ended up with about 8,100 pounds of forage, so that the day that we actually cut this corn crop, the next day we put cattle on it and we started grazing that day. And so there was no time delay between harvesting corn, planting a cover crop, and then finally being able to put cattle on it, typically about the middle of December if you do it that way with a winter cover crop. Start looking at your corn plants. Has anybody ever seen this on your corn plants? You have? Anybody else? Do y'all know what this is? I'm going to pick on you for a minute. I'm going to make y'all work. Do you know what lives in that? It's a bacteria that fixes nitrogen. So the University of Wisconsin is actually working to make a public corn variety. They found this corn, an ancient corn variety, all the way down in Mexico. And they're publicly breeding it right now. I actually met the lady who's breeding it for the university, to where we'll have public varieties that will actually be more beneficial to this right here. Pay attention to what your plants are doing, because if our plants can grow, it's a mucus, and it's like the consistency of snot. That's the only way I know how to compare it. But you'll start seeing this, and we start seeing nitrogen production from that mucus. And then this is a really good story. So Lance talked about that fungal to bacteria ratio, right? If you're too bacterial dominant, your system's too fast, it doesn't hold enough nutrients for growing a crop. If you go too fungal, like a forest, the nutrients are too slow. So about 3 or 4 years into this journey, we started seeing mushrooms growing in our field. I'm driving down the road one day. one of my neighboring farmers calls me and he said, "Hey man, you got mushrooms in your field." And I was like, "Oh really?" He was like, "Yeah." He's like, you got to go spray for that." I was like, I don't understand what you mean. Spray for what? He said, "Them mushrooms. Them mushrooms can't be good for your corn crop." I said, "Oh my God, do they have machetes? Are they cutting my corn down? Like, what's happening here? You know, is this VeggieTales? I got a little daughter at this point, I at least know that." But it's something different that a neighboring farmer had no idea, that we wanted to be fungally balanced and that mushrooms are okay. They're not going to destroy your corn, I promise. One of the things that we really learned from this actual field is that if you plant cover crops from it, Ray Archuleta will sprout up out of them when you need him. If you've ever needed Ray on the farm, that's how you do it. It's a 7-way mix, and you go out there and say Ray Archuleta 3 times, he'll just right up out of it. We host a bunch of field days. The first 4 years that I farmed, I had one farmer from my county show up, and he worked for Soil and Water, and it was his job. He had to be there. We hit the drought. Everybody saw how good our corn did in a stressful environment versus their corn. And now 80% of the farmers from our county come. Now, most of them aren't doing the extent of the practices that we're doing, but at least they're finally paying attention. And so, you know, you saw yesterday, we talked about our plots with regenerative practices, the nutrient density, and then I actually had this in my PowerPoint for today, and Trish talked about it yesterday, so y'all get to see the information. So we are connected to the food that we eat. It does matter about carbon. It matters about the products we use. It matters about the practices we put on our farm. So this is what Trish talked about yesterday. So from 1940 to 1991, this is 27 different forms of vegetables in the U.S. Our copper declined by 76%. Who's an agronomist in here? Anybody? What do plants use? I'll pick on you. I ain't gonna pick on you this time. What do plants use to fight off disease as a mineral? Copper. What copper? So if we've already lost 76% of the copper that's naturally in our plants, does that mean they're more susceptible to disease? To me, that means they are. Then we look at calcium, iron. Look at iron. I mean, how many? My sister is anemic. I didn't even know what that was till I was a teenager, but she has low blood iron. Like, how many people were actually anemic back in the 40s and 50s? Then we look at meat. Look at the iron decline in meat, 54%. Magnesium, potassium, calcium. Like, our model system in agriculture, if we are feeding actual feed to cattle, if we are buying supplemental nutrients, if we are putting micronutrients in tubs for cattle to eat, how are we this deficient even with throwing all of that at our animals and our livestock in conventional ag? How does that happen? So what that means is you have to eat twice as much meat, 3 times as many fruits and vegetables, or fruit, and then 4 to 5 times as many vegetables to get the same amount that we did back in 1940. I hate salads. I'm not going to eat 4 to 5 more times of salads than they did in the 40s. That's just not going to happen. So then we look at our vegetable production. Our farm grows about 5 to 6 acres every year of vegetable production. There's 3 churches in our county that we supply for their soup kitchen. They do community meals for people that need it. So one of the things that one of the churches came up with is they wanted to go chemical free. And we tried to science that out as much as we could. This is the best way possible. We got some scrap tires, put them all together. We pull it with a lawnmower so that drags down the cover crop, and then we put these tarps out. And instead of tilling the cover crops in, we take post hole diggers for transplants, or like a 6-inch tiller for putting in corn and other vegetables that we put in rows. But essentially, this has been the way that we've been able to get away from some of the chemicals. And then we also started looking at, as a young farmer, how many farmers in here were told that for your best yield, you need a picket fence stand, and you need even emergence on all your crops, right? Did you know that it doesn't matter what starter fertilizer you put on there, it doesn't matter how much pre-plant fertilizer you put on there, there's only one thing that has the most factor to do with even crop emergence and even stand. There were about 14 different universities that did these trials, and this is just on chili plants. I didn't have one on corn. but it's all based on percent of soil carbon. The more percent carbon we had, the better relationship we had with the plant, with the soil, and the better stand that we had in the beginning. And as you can see, every time the soil carbon went up, we had healthier, better looking plants. So Lance talked about the PLFA. It is kind of boring. I'm not going to go on it, but if you look at our PLFAs, that fungal to bacteria is one of the key things that we look at. We also look at our AMF, our mycorrhizal fungi populations. We also look at our bacteria. What we're looking at, these are just key indicators to take away. If you pull a PLFA, those are some of the key points that we look for. And this is what a lonely farmer looks like in his field. We were farming 1,000 acres and we were drilling all our cover crops 7 feet at a time. Being a beginning farmer, we had to start with smaller equipment. It was what we could afford. So essentially we have a 7-day harvest interval that we try to establish cover crops within 7 days after harvest. The soil biology has a 21-day life cycle. So if you don't have a live living root within a 21-day period, they'll actually start to decline in population. So we really try to maximize and chase the combine as hard as we can. And so after years and years of running this 7-foot drill, we finally got to upgrade, and now I have free time, and this is what a farmer looking for a girlfriend runs. Going from 7 foot to 15 foot was amazing. It's been great for our time management, and as other farmers, I do understand that harvest time is probably one of the worst times of the year for us to try to have free time. But even if we have to run all night sometimes, we do what we have to. And so then we'll talk about livestock integration. So started farming in 12, learned about Ray Archuleta in 2013. Ray calls me on the phone. He talked about mob grazing my cattle, packing them in like buffalo, making paddocks. And after 30 minutes of talking about it, he took a breath. Well, she's talked to Ray Archuleta then. So Ray's talking about what we need to do with our livestock, and I was like, Ray, I don't have cows. He's like, oh, you got to buy them. You got to buy cows. I don't know what it was like in Kansas, but 2013 was the highest we had ever seen cattle prices. Like to go to the sale barn and buy somebody's crazy heifer was $2 a pound. But Ray talked me into it. So we found a guy that said he had 14 cow-calf pairs. But he said only half of them had had their calves and the other half were springers, and that was my comment yesterday, is I thought springers meant they had calves in the spring, but I'd actually go to work at the fire department, they'd spring over the fence, highway patrol would call me, my cows are in the road, you got to come back and get them in. It was a whole mess. So we started making paddocks. I understand that most farmers that have cattle, they see forage as dollars and they want to maximize the amount of forage they take to get the dollars. But the most productive part of that plant is only in the top third. So once you go below the top third of the plant, you're not getting maximum production, you're pretty much getting fill. That's filler at that point. So when we move our cattle, you can see how much coverage that we still have. They've trampled down, the ground gets half and the cows get half. We make sure we get the most productive part of it and just a little bit more. And that's how we manage our operation. And so also for our summer grasses, our summer cover crops, bush hog is stripped down the field, put up a polywire fence. I don't know if you've put up any, who in here's done like the net fencing or the stranded wire. So we use an 8-wire strand. Buy these, if you're going to do this, buy a good reel. Because I went cheap the first time and there wasn't a rubber piece on this handle right here. When I connected it to the fence, it was a shocking experience. Because the one thing that I was taught in farming is under-engineer and over-electrify. And we had like a 10-mile charger on like 6 acres. And it, even as big as I am, it took me to my knees. And once again, this is taken in about 15 days from the first picture, but this is that first paddock. So what we see is when we don't overgraze, our recovery time is absolutely astonishing. We get faster regrowth, we get more biomass per acre. We're not taking out all the different species because cows like to selectively graze what they want if you don't pack them in tight enough and you don't move them fast enough. And so once again, this is after about 7 days on this paddock. We moved them over to the next one. And so you had a 7-day recovery time, then they were on this one, and so a total of about 14 to 15 days. This is almost ready to be grazed again. And then we talked about owning livestock, and the lady that wanted the whole pig and bacon yesterday. We also invite people to our farm every June from the county, and it's called the Farm to Fork Feast, and we essentially invite city people to come learn about country life. And so we had a lady out there one day, and she said, "Hey, is that where Neapolitan ice cream comes from?" It's just a belted Galloway. That's all it is. It just happens to be 2 different colors. But, these are things that we work with the public. Lee Holcomb, once again, got me into trouble. That's kind of a theme of this one, I guess. He talked me into Katahdin hair sheep. Rule number 1, don't ever buy sheep from Craigslist. The first 2 sheep that we bought off of Craigslist. I think we gave like $100 for the pair. These things had been bottle fed in a pen. They were not meant for the wild. I have learned that sheep were born to die. We had sheep for 3 years, and me and Lee did them together. This is actually behind Lee's house, where he was rotationally grazing them. We were simply having a conversation. A slight breeze blew in for about 10 seconds. 2 of the sheep fell dead. I looked at Lee and I said, "You can buy my half of the sheep, I can sell my half of the sheep, but I won't have sheep by the end of this month." I learned about fly strike, hoof rot, all the amazing things that sheep are capable of doing to not stay alive. Then we started looking at pigs. So my first house that I bought, we were semi in between the city and the country at that point, and we had about 2 acres behind our house. And so I started fencing in this nice lot behind the house. We had a little barn back there. All my neighbors thought we were getting dogs. Like, they were so excited. They were like, "Yeah, the neighbors are going to get puppies." And they came home one day and there were 14 Berkshire pigs in that pen. Some were excited, some not so much. A lot of letters. But we started with Berkshire pigs. Everybody said go with a heritage breed. These pigs are honestly, they're like dogs. They'll come up to you when you whistle for them. They love Little Debbie Christmas tree cakes in December. We feed them Girl Scout cookies. I mean, they really are. My little girl, she's 2 in this picture, but that's how she actually learned to count. She had 14 pigs, I had none. And there's actually one on here, we named her Miss Piggy, and she would actually be able to ride around on her back if I held her arm so she could steady. And so then we started looking at, well, can we take if we rotate these pigs around our crop ground, can we take a nutrient value to the manure? So my neighbor's kids, once again, got in trouble, so they had to go pull manure samples out of the field for us to send off for testing, but this is what we saw in our hog manure. And we were able to calculate that out, and that was just another credit that we were able to take. Now, everybody always asks me when I talk about moving pigs around our farm, well, what do you do about the ones that root? Pigs are going to root. What we do is we select the genetics that don't root. So if a pig roots in our field, that means they're too hot, so we send them to freezer camp to cool down. It works really well. So we talked a little bit about our marketing side. We market on Facebook, and we do most of our meat production on there. This is a picture of our bacon before we cured it. That's actually one of our pork chops. So we do what they call a porterhouse pork chop, which is the pork loin, as well as the chop with a wishbone in it. We cut them about 1.5 inches thick, and we can't keep these things in stock. But I mean, look at the marbling. I mean, do you see marbling like that inside of a grocery store? You typically don't. And so then we got on our journey of heirloom and open pollinated corn. Anybody in the room know Michael Thompson? So Michael Thompson's taller than I am. And this is Michael Thompson, and that's the corn ear above his head. This was actually the first crop of Bloody Butcher that we grew. We had a field day, and Michael, Jimmy, Rick, Gabe, Ray, all of them came out, and we were doing some field walks. But look at the tassels on that stuff. We see honeybees, pollinators, we see ladybugs. The more beneficial insects we see, the less predator population that we have to deal with. And so if you've never seen Bloody Butcher before, that's what Bloody Butcher looks like. Makes great grits and cornmeal. We make bourbon out of it as well. This is how we started. To give you an idea, this is how easy it was. We bought the cheapest bags. I think we paid about 10 cents a bag for those clear plastic bags. We actually found a mill that would mill it up for us at that point, and we sold two packs of it. One bag of grits and cornmeal, one bag of grits, one bag of cornmeal, and we sold them for 15 bucks. And then this is my daughter Emma a little bit later. She likes picking corn. We were picking beans when she was about 5, and she got out of the cab and shut the door, and the bean dust got all over her, and she told me it itched too much. She won't pick beans with me anymore, but she's usually my sidekick. And so then we started using cover crops on the farm quite a bit. We started working with distilleries and breweries like Sierra Nevada. We started having to clean so much seed, and the closest seed cleaner that we could find was about 6 to 9 hours away. And so I actually came to Kansas. I don't know if you know where Kingman, Kansas is. Drove out to Kingman, Kansas. This great guy, he was probably in his 70s. His dad had actually bought this seed cleaner who had passed away. I quickly learned Kansas really, some of the older folks love their tillage. Like he had a brand new 40-foot Landau disc, and he was so happy about it. Told me about how the dirt smelled when he turned it over, asked me if I wanted to run it. I told him I didn't know how. So we built a 50 by 80 building. We put in a seed cleaner, a gravity table. I like building stuff. We actually, all these tan colored hoppers, we fabricated ourselves in the building, but this one right here, we can clean and grade seed for our farm or other farmers, scale it at the same time. We can blend cover crop seed, and we also bag it as well. So we try to keep as much as we can in-house. So if you don't have at least one failure a year, are you even really farming? We talked a little bit about failures last year. I'll tell you about one of our failures. I don't have a lot of pictures of it. One of the big things that farmers have been working on is delayed termination of cover crops. And so you plant your corn or your soybeans, typically wait somewhere between 2 to 6 weeks, and then you go out there and terminate it at that point. On this side of the road, we made about 175 bushel corn. On this side of the road, we made about 45 bushel corn. We went through such a dry spell early in the season that the delayed termination on that cover crop by 4 to 6 weeks really just sucked the rest of the moisture out of there. Had a great cover crop stand, just weren't able to make money off of that. But we did it on a small scale. That was about 5 acres of the field that we did that study in. And the reason I talk about it is I can't tell you what to do on your farm, but think outside of the box. Try something different. You can't open up a national farming magazine anymore without hearing about a soil health principle or practice that somebody else is trying that's crazy, like intercropping, companion cropping, the delayed termination. Look at different things that you can try on your farm and see what's going to work for your area and your operation. So, does anybody have any questions at this point? I didn't get any during the PowerPoint, but does anybody have any questions that we could talk about? Right here, one. Huh? Oh, how many cows died from that initial purchase? Oh, they're all hamburger by now. We went from cow-calf to stalker. Stalker steers were still kind of crazy to me. They were a little wild. But we definitely got out of the cow-calf operation there for several years. I learned how to pull my first calf out of those original 14 cows at like 4 in the morning. I learned that heifers are really good at playing hide and go seek. So when we went to go tag the calves, like the heifer would look over here and you would search that entire part of the field, and it was literally like 10 feet away from her on the opposite side. So we went stalkers for a while, and now we're back to cow-calf.
Everybody awake?
I don't know. They look.
Okay, we got a couple more minutes. We got
one here.
Try. Okay, so just to follow your story of rolling down the cover crop.
Yep.
You sprayed it first. So is that an herbicide?
When we first started farming, before we had the ability to roll and plant at the same time, and we didn't have a sprayer, the co-op wanted to come out and spray at least 100 acres. And so, yeah, they would come spray it before we planted it, but we don't do that anymore except for 1 year. And it comes down to management. If it's really dry in the spring and our soil probes say that we're sucking all the moisture out of the ground, yes, I will go out there and spray every acre of cover crop. But if we have adequate moisture and we're getting rain, I like to plant into it green and standing because I'm maximizing, one, the carbon that the plant is putting into the ground, and two, the biomass that we're building, which then converts into organic matter. But yes, I mean, back then, that's the only option we had was to spray ahead, and we were using a herbicide. Typically, we use gramoxone.
Okay.
Okay, I was offended that you that you kind of pooped all over the idea of sheep. I realize I'm among cattle people probably. Yes, Lynette would be proud, correct?
It takes a special person to raise sheep, and I'm not knocking on them. I'm just saying that,
You bought the wrong sheep.
oh, I did. I agree.
We bought ours from Gail and Lynette and from Hank and Joanna Will.
You need better genetics than Craigslist, I agree.
Yes, and they have been awesome for us.
Yeah.
In management, and we're only on 20 acres and we're new farmers. So my question to you is, do you diversify with your animals as well, other than cattle and pigs?
Right now, no.
Why not?
Chickens? Patience and time. I mean, when I'm here with y'all, so that's one of the things, we talk about rotational grazing, okay? And you hear so many people get on stage and talk about rotational grazing. It's so rigid, so rigid, and this many days in this paddock and this many days in that paddock. I want to live. I worry about quality of life. So if I want to go to the beach for a week on vacation, open them up, give them the whole farm. When I get back in a week, I find the best spot, put them back in there, and start a rotation again. And as farmers, why are we going to put ourselves in such a constraint that we can't enjoy to go to the beach or go on vacation for a week? Or I don't really know what y'all go to in Kansas. I mean, we have beach and mountains, but do y'all find
Go to the blue-green lake.
do y'all find a holler and have like a bonfire in a holler somewhere?
But we do the same thing with sheep and chicken. We do the same thing with sheep and chickens. We have livestock guardian dogs and a couple of donkeys.
Yeah,
and
but
we just
listen.
turn them out.
When we talk about cows, so in 2018, when we had all that rain and our cows were getting bale grazed in a lot, my bale grazing is you put the bale out there and you roll it out. They're going to eat some, incorporate in some. We were trying to maximize it. When I was gone for 2 weeks for a conference, I'm just glad my dad was willing to put a hay bale in there for them to feed on. So, I mean, we don't have a lot of farm help if I'm not there. So we have to really look at our time management for when we're gone.
It won't work where you
Yeah, oh yeah, that's very much adaptive grazing.
So it won't work where you are?
No, chickens will work great. We have tons of people that do poultry chicken. We have tons of people that do sheep, and they do good at it. I'm just not much of a nurturer when it comes to sheep. I'm more of the selectiveness, We should take the warning labels off of everything and just see who makes it.
Quality of life decision.
Yeah.
So in your early days, when you were rolling ahead of the planter, a 7 feet roller and a wider than that planter, do you have problems if you're drilling into the direction the opposite way it was rolled? How did you deal with that?
Y'all make me think of so many good memories. A good example. We have a highway that goes by one of our main fields, runs north and south. I mean, tried and true as that line is in the floor. And Dad came to help me on the farm, and I said, hey, look, roll it north and south. Okay. This is my north and south, and this is his north and south. That cover crop would come up and hit the front bar of that planter. It would wrap on the angle shaft. It would wrap on the coulter. It would wrap on the closing wheels. It literally wrapped on everything we could. I was worried about seed to soil contact. Luckily, it planted it great, but it was a nightmare. So if you don't have a roller that matches the planter, I've seen it done 2 different ways, and we've done it one of the ways. We actually used to go out at that point and plant and then roll afterwards. And we would essentially just cut across at a 45 because your planter's already laying a good amount down. And if we would cut at a 45, we would get 99% of it down. In soybeans, in soybeans, if you don't roll it, it's not a massive problem. beans can deal with the light issues. They're not going to super, get leggy like corn will. Now, corn, we didn't roll one time, and the cover crop was still 3 feet tall, and the corn just had a spindly stalk on it. It was yellow, and it was just trying to grow at such a rapid pace to get up to that sunlight. Corn is critical to get that cover crop down onto the ground. Beans, not so much. But yes, if you don't have a roller that matches your planting width, then you need to either make sure you have GPS good enough to where you're going to hit the right lines, or you need to roll afterwards and do it after you've planted at that point.
All right, one more.
Do you have any problems with rodents? I know some of the guys that I've worked with that been doing covers for several years. We've got voles and different types of rodents that'll take out the crop and in areas. Have you ever had any issues with that?
So typically the only time we've got voles as well, and the only time that we have problems with voles is if we leave it standing. If we get that cover crop flat onto the ground, our vole issue is pretty much never. Not saying we don't have a few spots from here to year, but it's so small, it's not even worth us worrying about it. The one thing I will say is as we've introduced these regenerative practices and we've brought livestock in, not only do we see like the beneficial insects, but we see beneficial predators as far as like hawks. I've never seen that many predatory birds on our farms, and as we've seen that increase, we've also seen our populations of pests decrease.
Yeah, that's the first thing I ever did was go on the internet and Google what the predator or whatever it was, because there's always something out of balance. So
Yeah.
Is there something I can do to promote the predator to come in and take care of that? All right, with that, how about a round for
Thanks for
Russell?
your time.